really what was West Indian Federation. The federation was established in 1958 and it comprised of 10 territories. It's very important that you bear this in mind. The 10 territories at the time were Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Montserrat, Jamaica, then St. Kitts and Nevis, Angola, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Trinidad and Tobago. And it was established by the British Caribbean Federation of 1956 with the aim of establishing a political union among its members. Federation was almost an inevitable occurrence. You had a set of peoples who share a common history, and it's a common history of chattel slavery, plantation slavery. The forward step for these group of peoples who have mostly a common African history and markers of African culture would be to create in this space a political union. In that political union, they would seek to assert their own sense of self and hopefully their own sense of independence. Federal government was headed by an executive governor general, and that he was appointed by Great Britain. The governor general at the time was Lord Hales, and the first prime minister of the federal parliament was Sir Ramphal Adams. So during its brief existence in 1958 to 62, several key steps were made by the federal government. And I'm just trying to give a sense of what really the federation sought to do. They began establishing and supporting structures such as a federal civil service. They established the West Indies Shipping Service in 1962, and they embarked on negotiations to acquire a subsidiary of the British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOA, namely British West Indies Airways, BWIA, which was later called. And they started discussions on the establishment and creation of a university college, among other things. So that in a nutshell was what Federation sought to do. But as with any political union and with any group of diverse peoples, there would be differences. These differences eventually led to the collapse of the Federation. Now, we could always go into the political histories of why it was that the Federation itself collapsed. But we don't really have to, and we're not going to do that here this evening. The songs made by the musicians at the time, especially Calypsonians, later persons who did ska and metal, sought to record for posterity how the people felt about Federation, how the people felt about the dissolution of Federation, and how they felt about Jamaica moving toward being.
I have often speculated on what would have happened had we gone forward as a nation. We would have created in the Caribbean a centrality a nationhood that I believe would have occupied a place of significance with what were then the old dominions of Canada and Australia. The West Indies, it would have provided in a natural way for all those things that we have had to work and fail at, like production integration, trying to bring together in a unified program separate sovereign states. It was as if we created the impediments to progress before we tried to progress, and then we came up against those impediments that we'd created.
In order for that federation to have been a success, they needed a strong they needed a strong leader in the person of Mr. Manley. That's the first thing. It also required a certain commitment and less talking from the junior ministers who came to the federal government from the smaller territory. There was never any lack of rhetoric, more often than not misguided rhetoric. And whenever you seem to be overcoming one problem, another problem will arise. So there was a certain reticence that was required and a certain restraint on the part of the political sector that was lacking.
The eyes of the world were on the Honorable Norman Manley, Premier of Jamaica, as he prepared to leave his homeland for the most momentous of all conferences. The failure in practice of the Federation of the West Indies and its dissolution were common knowledge. Now Jamaica went to the conference table confident in her own future as an independent country and determined to bring the date of fulfillment as near as possible. Meanwhile, at Palisados Airport, more delegates were leaving Jamaica for the conference. There to see them off was Sir Alexander Bustamante, the leader of the opposition. Sir Alexander was unfortunately unable to attend the opening session, but he was to be there in time for the important discussions which followed. During his absence, the opposition delegates were headed by their deputy leader, Mr. Sangster. Mr. Manley then spoke.
Mr. Secretary, this Independence Conference marks the beginning of the end of a very long road which started over 300 years ago when one of the happy accidents of naval warfare resulted in the capture of Jamaica from the Spanish crown in 1655. The road ends, Mr. Secretary, at a time when all empires decline, when colonialism has become a word of ugly meaning, when the sun sets round the world chiefly on the flags of free peoples with whom we hoped soon to walk in peace and friendship, when late, but more than ready, we joined the great company of the new nations of the world. There is no country in the world not now independent which is more fit to achieve that status than Jamaica now is. Indeed, we have been ready for independence long ago, and no doubt would have achieved it already, but for the fact that as far back as 1949 we committed ourselves to an experimental trial marriage with the other territories of the West Indies, if I may so describe the union in federation now coming to an end.
Mr. Sangster followed for the parliamentary opposition, but there was no divergence of policy about independence.
Mr. Secretary, I speak on behalf of the opposition. We have listened with great interest to your remarks, and we reciprocate your good wishes for a successful conference. The Premier has told you something about the events leading up to this conference. Jamaica has been independent-minded for a long time. You have only to read the reports of the parliamentary debates of 200 years ago to realize that even then, the colonials of those days wanted their own way of life. We started on the last road to independence in 1938, but we paused on the way to help federation. Then in 1959, my party began the campaign to take Jamaica out of federation. Here let me borrow from the words of Brutus. It was not that we loved others less, but we loved Jamaica more.
Then, on the 9th, the doors were opened again. and the press admitted to witness the most historic scene of all, the signing of the report of the conference, which was an agreement of independence. Independence on August the 6th, 1962. It was a moment of triumph for the delegates from Jamaica. They had succeeded completely in all they had set out to do.